Hello, everyone. My name's Rich Jones, Editorial Director at Devex, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Christine So, President and CEO at Humentum, a leading global nonprofit working with humanitarian and development organizations to improve operations and accountability and make communities more equitable and resilient. Welcome, Christine, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Now, in recent years, Christine, we've seen an increasing trend in discussions surrounding the adoption of locally led development approaches. However, translating this agenda into practice has proven challenging. Maybe we can begin by offering some context to our audience. How do you define locally led development, and how does it guide your work at Humentum?
Thanks so much. For us, locally led development is really the idea that those who live and are affected most closely by issues should be leading the conversation, the discussions, the design, and the execution of the solutions to those problems. And that by having people who are the best informed and the most closely informed, we end up with more efficient, but also more appropriate solutions that actually gain traction and can lead to long-term change. And so at Humentum, we faced the challenge of, do we do this as a siloed element of our work, or do we really integrate it across everything that we do? And we've opted for the latter, really trying to think about global development from that lens and how we need to operationalize changes to the way that global development and humanitarian assistance work to actually give that voice and that power and that space to the people who are closest to the problems.
Thanks for that. And where does the development community currently stand when it comes to implementing this localization agenda? And how does Humentum's Equitable, Resilient, and Accountable, or ERA index, help to assess progress here?
So first, I want to just make a quick comment because you've now used the term locally led development as well as localization. Language matters, and we hear different terms being used. We also hear power shift. We hear a move towards equity. These terms are not necessarily interchangeable, and so we just want to be careful about how we're using them and what we're saying. Locally led development, I've already talked about how we see that. For localization, I think we see that as more the movement towards how the work is being done. But there is still quite a lot of discussion around all of these terms. For us, we do see a real movement across global development and humanitarian assistance in talking about this, thinking about this, and somewhat in moving towards it. But we see that there's a wide spectrum of transformation going on, and funders, organizations working across many countries, so international NGOs and local and national NGOs are all approaching this slightly differently depending on where they're starting from and where they want to end up. We have implemented now the ERA index, Equitable, Resilient, and Accountability Index, starting last year in 2022, and we'll be doing it again in 2023. And we use that as an assessment for organizations to really look at how they're doing across a number of questions. And then that gives us an indication of how the sector is doing. We focused on international NGOs in the first edition, and this year are looking to expand that based on some of the work that we've been doing with national NGOs to give a broader picture. I think really what we're seeing coming out of all of the convening that we're doing, both with funders, with international NGOs and national NGOs, is that, as I've already indicated, there are different ideas about how this transformation needs to happen and where it's actually going, and also that organizations are at different places. And so at Humentum, we meet organizations where they are. We help identify with them what their priority issues are, but in everything that we're doing, we are really pushing them to focus on equity, to focus on resilience, and to focus on accountability.
And perhaps you could walk us through some of the barriers that these organizations are facing, and how you're helping them to overcome these barriers in practical terms.
Sure. We're thinking about this in terms of locus of control, and we see, and the index has shown us that, organizations have issues that they feel firmly in control of, and they have issues that are much more difficult for them to respond to because they don't control. So outside of the locus of control typically is considered funding models, and how funders transmit funds and the risk and compliance and due diligence that they attach to those funds. Organizations work with those funders on their grant conditions and their reporting and their compliance, but we find that organizations, especially younger organizations that don't feel that they have a lot of power in the equation, have a hard time pushing back with funders about how those risk and compliance requirements are set up, and that this leads to organizations working very much in the way that the funders are dictating, rather than frequently in the ways that make the most sense. At Humentum, we're really trying to work towards the sector adopting a much more trust-based model of compliance, so that organizations who are identified by funders for what they do best are allowed to do what they do best, and of course are meeting reporting requirements, but in a way that is really trust based, rather than more of a policing approach to risk and compliance. We work with organizations on what's inside of their locus of control. So we do work with them on leadership, governance, thinking about who their sources of funding are, how they can set up their organizations to best deliver on what it is that is their mission. But really, I like to talk about, we are operationalizing equity. So we are thinking about, we've got a lot of people and a lot of organizations doing a lot of talking about what it means to be locally led, about what it means to be more equitable in approach, but they really get stuck on just the very practical, the practicalities of doing that. And so we work with them on their institutional architecture, on their people and culture, on their financing and financial systems, and on their risk and compliance, to really help them create organizations and organizational models that will get them to the point that they aspire to, rather than them having big dreams and not being able to do it because they get stuck on policies and very practical issues.
And so this work is guided by Humentum's theory of change. Could you talk us through that and help us unpack what that entails?
Sure. So our theory of change, in essence, is very simple. It's the idea that organizations will do better work if they are autonomous in the way that they operate. And so we help organizations build that autonomy through operating models that, again, bring them to delivering the missions that they have adopted. But within the theory of change, we've really taken what we hear from our constituents, from our stakeholders, from those with whom we work, and that inspires the way that we prioritize the kinds of issues that we're approaching. So, for instance, right now we have been holding a compensation working group for a large group of organizations, where they are looking at what does it mean to distribute their leadership away from having Northern-based, so a Washington-based executive team, to having an executive team that is located across the globe. So really representing the communities in which they're working and getting the best talent possible for their organization. Well, when you do a distributed staffing model like that, you also really have to think about what your global compensation approach looks like. You also have to look at it because in global development and humanitarian assistance, we come from a traditional model where people working in the countries where the work is done are typically paid less than those working at the global level for the organization. And that is, in essence, inequitable, but it's also very complex. And so that kind of issue is one that is really well approached when we can do it as a community, when we can share our different challenges, our different thoughts, our different solutions, and really co-create the approaches that may be best suited for global development as a whole. And so that's just one example, but we really take an integrated knowledge approach where we are working with a large group of stakeholders, pulling from that, integrating that into the solutions that are being put together, and then putting those back out.
And talking about sort of crowdsourcing and pulling in the inspiration from across the development community, Humentum has recently wrapped up a series of reports where you spoke with hundreds of funders, policymakers, international and local NGO leaders, and the aim there was to glean insights on what's needed to advance locally led development. Could you give us your sort of top line takeaways here?
Sure. So one thing I just want to say is we did deliberately go out and seek interviews with some people, but in fact, much of this was really taken from the convening that we do on a regular basis. We host a locally led development webinar series every year. We have convening groups around functional areas, as I've noted, around institutional architecture, operating models, human resources, funding and financial systems. And so these reports are really pulled from all of those discussions, and we are planning to do the same in the coming year, again, to reflect what we're hearing and get further in depth on a lot of these issues. Really, the top line is that, probably a surprise to no one, but there is a power imbalance within global development. And money talks, and many of us jump to that money or organize ourselves in the way we do things according to how the funding flows. And so in our approach, we are really taking what we call the three-legged stool approach to stakeholders. We look at funders, international NGOs, and national NGOs. And we recognize that within global development and humanitarian assistance, these three stakeholder groups are really inextricably linked, and we can't look at transformation or solutions in a vacuum. We really have to look across those three groups and look at the power dynamics amongst them. In terms of kind of the top line elements that have come out of our discussions, as I've noted, institutional architecture, which is really about the business models, the operating models, the leadership, the governance, that is defining the parameters around which or through which these organizations are working. People and culture, again, these organizations, they depend on their people. In large part, we are thinking organizations. We are not organizations that are producing widgets for sale. And so our people are our greatest asset. And so moving towards having really global talent pools and talent pools where people are reaching their true momentum and potential is really important. And by operationalizing these talent pools, it really does improve the way that these organizations are working. Funding and financial systems, it is about where the funds are coming from, but it's also about how the funds are being managed. And in particular, and this is really a key element across all three stakeholder groups, is getting full and fair funding for the work that is being implemented. We know, and this is very tightly linked to the idea of stewardship and to risk and compliance, but there's this idea that overheads are a bad thing, that we really have to account for every penny that is spent, for every tiny activity that is undertaken. And in fact, what we see is, talking across all of these groups, that especially with the national NGOs and also international NGOs, that they don't have adequate funding to develop their talent pools. They are frequently having to take, funds from their reserves or funds from unrestricted funding and put them towards subsidizing the project work that they're doing because they're not getting full funding from the funding agencies. And we see that that has a real impact on their actual efficiencies and effectiveness, and that they have to choose to run other risks, such as attrition in staff, such as not having the digital security, the online security that they need, because they can't afford to do that and also deliver on results. So I think for us, really moving towards full and fair funding is a key element of all of this. And without it, we're not going to see a move towards local organizations being actually able to implement in the ways that they know that they can, and also that we see large global organizations and funding agencies saying they want to happen, but it can't happen under the way that the funding is currently structured. Over.
So full and fair funding, how optimistic are you that this sort of change, this sea change will happen? What's needed to accelerate progress here, and how do we ensure that that progress is sustained? What's your call to action?
Well, so one thing is that I've been in global development for 30 years. I've heard this kind of thing before. I think we do actually have real traction happening, and that's exciting. And we're excited at Humentum to be joining up with organizations that are really deeply working in this. And I think that as, we refer to this as the collective journey to equitable development. And so it really does take all of us working together to move forward. We do see funding agencies moving towards this, and it's exciting. I want to call out the Ford Foundation. I think through their Build program, they've been particularly outspoken about this. And there is certainly a lot of other and an increasing number of other funding agencies that are wading into this. I think, it's scary. And we are working on, in terrain that we have talked about for a long time, but we haven't actually been able to really move the needle on in the ways that we need to. And so now I think we're seeing that happen. In terms of a call to action, I'm really excited. We have a new report that's just been released this past week that is amplifying national NGO leader voices on locally led development. We were aware that there's a lot of discussion around locally led development, but we're not hearing from the people who are closest to it and are the ones who are supposed to be bringing it forward. And so we really wanted to give them a platform to be heard and to have the spotlight on them. What we hear from them is that they are willing and ready to go, but they need to have funders taking them seriously, listening to them, and they need to be at the table. Not just, holding periodic consultations with national and local leaders on a one-off basis, but really building them and their perspectives into the processes from the beginning. I think that is the thing that is going to move the needle, but it does mean that we all have to be willing to give up some of the power and agency that we have held on to very, very tightly from the traditional global development models, and give that up, be willing to take risks, and be willing to speak to the sources of that funding that we are passing along and executing within global development, to explain why this is important and to explain why it is better that communities have the ultimate power over their own development issues and solutions.
Dr. Christine, so thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to following up on your progress at Humentum in the coming months here on Devex.com.
Thank you so much, and it was really a pleasure to speak with you today. Onward.